comes to mind when you hear the word chocolate? Maybe a ooey gooey chocolatey dessert or your favorite candy bar. Americans love chocolate. In fact, we consume 2.8 billion pounds of chocolate every year. That works out to about 11 pounds a person. The scientific name of the tree that produces chocolate is called Theobroma, which comes from the Greek word theo, meaning gods, and broma, meaning food. So chocolate literally means food of the gods. But there's a dark side to the chocolate industry that's hidden from the public. In a report titled The Good, the Bad, and the Savory, published by Jay Robbins in 2002, the author revealed that hundreds of thousands of children are sold as slaves to cocoa farmers in West Africa and forced to do manual labor to pick the cocoa that big companies use to produce our favorite candy bars. Policy needs to be put in place to prevent big companies from buying from these unconstitutional cocoa farms and keep their suppliers transparent to the public. So there's a place called the Ivory Coast. It's the world's largest cocoa supplier. In fact, they produce about 70% of the cocoa that America buys. So this area is located between Liberia and Ghana. And in an article, A New Slavery, published in History Today, Angela John claims that about 90% of the farms located on the Ivory Coast use child slaves to get their cocoa. These slaves are aged 12 to 14, sometimes even younger, and work 80 to 100-hour weeks. They're unpaid, barely fed, and even beaten. And most of them never even see their families again. In 2001, the House of Representatives tried to pass a bill that would require the chocolate industry to label their chocolate as slave-free, but the companies argued that since they didn't own the cocoa farms, that they didn't bear any responsibility for the child slaves there, and they even hired lobbyists who were former senators to combat the bill, and it wasn't passed. So in 2005, the bill was reintroduced, and in an article published by New Internationalist in 2006 titled Chocolate and Child Slaves, it was stated that Nestle's defense against their accusations that they had been using child slaves said that slavery was not a crime against humanity. And they didn't even deny that they used or they purchased from suppliers who used child slaves to get their cocoa. They also chose not to attend an investigation into child slavery in the child industry. Deborah Orr says in her 2006 article titled Slave Chocolate that Nestle promised to find a way to certify its chocolate had not been produced by slavery by July 2005, but the deadline passed and Nestle didn't make any changes and there were no repercussions. So Nestle makes like some really well-known candy bars. Butterfingers, Crunch, Baby Ruth, Kit Kats, their chocolate milk. All of that cocoa is sourced from the Ivory Coast, and the cocoa is picked by child slaves. So at this point, a lot of stories have surfaced about kids working along the Ivory Coast. This is the story of Ali Diabate, who was a former slave, and his story was published in Current Events in 2002 in an article titled Slaves to Chocolate. He was 12 years old when he was promised $150 a year and a bicycle to go work on the Ivory Coast, and instead he was sold for $35 to a farmer who beat him, forced him to work 12-hour days in the scorching heat, and even whipped him. There's other children who told their testimonies on this farm who said that when they tried to escape and they were caught, their feet were cut so they couldn't run, and they were still forced to work while their wounds healed. These kids had to use machetes to get the pods of the chocolate off the tree and then scrape the seeds out, and it was really labor intensive. It takes about 400 beans just for 1 pound of chocolate. And you have 12-year-olds using these big knives to just scrape, like in that photo on the left, and the photo on the right is Ali. And chocolate isn't part of the African diet. So after he was freed from the camp, Ali said he'd never tasted chocolate and didn't even know what it was. So although they contribute to child labor, slavery, and human trafficking, the chocolate industry has not taken steps to fix the problem. They're a $60 billion industry, and they have the power to end slavery by paying the farmers a living wage for their supplies. A lot of the big companies have promised to be slave-free by 2020, but companies like Hershey still won't even release where they source their cocoa, and that just shouldn't be allowed. You should have to be transparent about where you're getting your supplies from, and a policy should be in place that would require them to be transparent, and they should want to be transparent. I feel like at this point, we should be trying to do everything we can to end child slavery. Child slavery is illegal. So if this issue is not resolved, things are going to continue to worsen. Nestle says that we can see positive changes and there's evidence of fewer children being exposed to unsafe conditions, but it just is not true. If you look at this graph, you can see that the amount of child slaves in West Africa has doubled in the last 4 years. This is partially due to an increase in demand in chocolate. In a 2006 article published in Food Logistics called Child Labor Disclosure, a federal judge said that it was no duty of the chocolate industry to disclose suppliers use slaves. And then, this was in 2016, they tried to reintroduce the label that would require Hershey Nestle to put on their wrapper that said that no slaves had been used in the production of the chocolate. And the judge said that courts should determine what occupies the limited space on a candy bar. Stated in an article, Consumers Sue Nestle, published by Business Wire just this year, Massachusetts consumers sued Nestle because they didn't disclose that they purchased farms that use slaves. So, despite all the heat that the chocolate industry has faced since 2001, we haven't seen much change. Hershey's and Mars both promised to be fair trade by 2020, but the deadlines have been overlooked before with little repercussions, so we need to have a policy in place that keeps check on the industry and keeps the sourcing transparent to consumers. So what can you do? Only buy fair trade chocolate. So look for these sellers on the right. Don't buy from the sellers on the left. All those big names, Hershey, Mars, Nestle, See's, all sourced from the Ivory Coast. Also, if you see that Fair Trade Certified label on candy, that means that no slaves were used in the processing of the chocolate. And although it can be more expensive, as a consumer, when you purchase slave-free chocolate, it gives you peace of mind knowing that you helped pay the wage of the farmer and the workers who picked the cocoa. So it's really important that we bring awareness to this issue and bring justice to the slaves on the Ivory Coast and hold the big corporations accountable who disregard basic human rights.